Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Across the room is Ben Kinsley. Ben, how are you? Welcome.
Good,
Ben's
thanks, Pat.
a co-sponsor, co-producer, and co-host.
Yeah.
Did all three. I
You
usually
got all
mess
three of
one
them.
of them up. Can you talk a little bit, really quickly, about your other work and why you're
My other work?
sponsoring our show?
Sure. Yeah, I have a consulting firm called Imperium Advisors, and originally started out as a policy research and development organization, and quickly realized it's not enough to have a good idea. You have to be able to sell that idea. So from that came a whole bunch of other things that we do, everything from grassroots organizing, advocacy, communications, government relations, you name it. So yeah, check us out, imperiumvt.com.
Good intro. Thank you very much. He's a real policy wonk. We know this.
I've been called
Anyway,
that on
our
occasion.
guest tonight, I am very pleased because he's actually never been on our show, and I
That is
apologize
correct.
for that. This is Senator President Pro Tem Tim Ashe. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So we just had a discussion before about half the people, what is a pro tem? Maybe just quickly you could talk about, so who are you exactly in
Yeah,
this?
it's, I don't think people take Latin in high school
Yeah, no,
anymore,
oh,
so using
yeah.
the word pro tem, people's face sort of look, they go blank.
They even know how to pronounce it.
I know, pro tempore, they have to cut it down
Oh,
to pro
that's right,
tem.
there's a little, yeah.
So the short story is the lieutenant governor presides over the Senate, and the origin of the title of my position basically means president for the time being, which means when the lieutenant governor is not there, I preside. Over time, the position has really changed to become the elected leader of the Senate. So while the lieutenant governor presides and is technically the president, I am effectively the leader of the Senate because the other 29 voted for me.
Someday we'll have to do a show on when Peter Shumlin asked me to do a plate on Senate Pro Tem. That is a story in itself. I don't know where that plate is. Do you have it?
I don't. No, I get nothing. I get abuse and hostile emails, but no license, and a parking space. But
that is true.
Other than that, nothing.
The pro tem and the lieutenant governor get some of the best parking spots.
Well, no, it's closest to the building. However, it's the most difficult spot to park in because it's on a complete arced bend in the driveway leading up to the State House. So almost every morning I pull in, and I'm not an early riser, and I have an audience of people watching me try to park. And of course, the governor's SUV is right behind my spot, his security thing. So I'm always like partially worried I'm going to hit his car, and people will see
There'd
it.
be a headline.
Yeah,
That'd be name recognition.
So even the parking space is sort of,
and that vehicle is a little bigger than the parking space too, so you don't have a whole lot of wiggle room.
Exactly.
All right. So anyway, we'd like in the beginning of the show we ask our guests to tell a little bit about their background and maybe why you came to be the Senate Pro Tem.
Sure. So I came to Vermont to attend the University of Vermont and in the mid-90s and graduated in 1999 and wasn't quite sure what was going to happen next to me, but probably the professor with whom I was closest at the time, Richard Sugarman, who incidentally was a religion professor, but I had done work study under him because that was one of the ways I paid my way through school. He said, "How would you like to work for Bernie Sanders?" And I had not been someone who was particularly clued into political stuff in college, and but they were very close, and Bernie needed someone in a kind of entry position, and this was when he was a House member. And I said, "Well, how's this going to work?" He said, "When they call for the interview, just go."
Yeah, right, exactly.
And sure enough, I got a call, and Bernie's then chief of staff for Vermont called and introduced himself, said, "Bernie would like to interview you in 15 minutes.
Whoa.
So I'm, about to be college graduate, I don't own any clothes appropriate for a job interview at the time. And when I explained this to his chief of staff, he said, "All that matters is you get here."
There you go.
So I threw on a pair of blue Dickies and hustled my way to the end of Church Street and had an interview with Bernie, and that kind of got me going in this world. And over time, I was on the Burlington City Council for 4 years, so was sort of in the thick of things in municipal government, and was an affordable housing developer at Cathedral Square, which people in northwestern Vermont would be more familiar with, but we also manage properties in downtown Waterbury and other places, which was affordable senior housing and housing for people with disabilities. And
which we desperately need all over this
yeah,
place.
we would open a building and it would be full
bet.
within a day, and there'd already be a waiting list that had grown overnight. And so My professional experience has largely been in affordable housing and community development. And back when I was leaving the Burlington City Council, I decided to run for Chittenden State Senate, and Jim Condos had been in one of the 6 seats but
Right.
left. And I thought, well, what the heck, I'll take a shot at it. I didn't really have a lot of organizational support, but I squeaked in just barely.
Good.
And have had I felt really blessed for the last 12 years to be there in different roles, and in the last 4 as the president of the Senate.
That's great.
And, really
Can I do
enjoy
a
it.
sideline question? They didn't break up the 6-pack yet, did
So-
they? Are they thinking
Oh.
about it next year?
So I'm
Because I thought they did already.
No,
and I
next
was-
year.
It's a good question. So I have always believed that the Chittenden Senate District, which for your viewers might not know, there is no Senate district in America that has more than 2.
Oh,
The only ones more than 2 are in Vermont. There are three three-seaters, including Washington County, Windsor
Yep,
County,
right.
and Rutland County. And then the only one exceeding 3 is in Vermont, and that is Chittenden County with 6. I've always believed that it's just not the right relationship between an elected representative and 150,000 people,
Right.
especially when we have no resources to communicate. It creates a distance and a lack of real connection. And so I've had other attempts fail, like trying to do a constitutional amendment to break up the district. But last year, I was able to pass a statutory change, which said that at the next redistricting, which will happen next year after the census, no district can exceed 3 seats.
excellent.
So the Chittenden
Thank you.
district, some
Yeah.
people think, oh, there's going to be 2 3-seaters. Well, no, we have made no such decision. The
Right.
only decision is that there will no longer be 6. It will be broken up in some configuration, and I think
Great.
it'll be better elected representation.
Okay, cool. I knew
As-
they did something, but Erica Reddick, who's running for the council, was on the show last week, and I said, "Oh, they've already done it." And she said, "Well, I'm not sure that's."
passed the
exactly-"
law, but the
Yeah,
execution happens
thank
after
you.
the
So
census.
we were both right.
Yeah, because it's waiting for the census before you redistrict.
That's right.
This
Yeah.
is the every 10-year
'Cause
deal.
in the legislature, it does make a cabal of some sort. There's 6
Yeah,
of them if they choose to.
If we chose to,
if
and
you choose-
I will be honest though, and I think as people who've been in Montpelier, Chittenden County is unique amongst Vermont counties in terms of its proximity to the airport, to the university and other colleges.
Right.
It has an economic vitality,
sure.
which is not to be taken for granted, but it is different.
It is different.
But I'll say the senators representing Chittenden County, when I think about which senators I've served with are more provincial, meaning just taking care of home, back home.
right.
The Chittenden senators have taken a more expansive view as a general rule,
Yeah.
even though we get beat up on all the time. And
Well, what happens in Burlington absolutely has an impact
that's right.
on the state. You can't deny. I mean, you can't
That's,
deny that. so-
I always say that the strength of the state really depends on Chittenden County.
Right.
All the rest of the counties benefit when Chittenden County does
Right.
well. Chittenden County benefits when everyone else does well. People live in Chittenden County because they love the whole state and they want to be able to get out and experience all the
Yeah.
rest.
Right.
The rest of the state benefits by the good work that happens
For
in
sure.
Chittenden County. So I sometimes get not upset but worried that there's a demonization of Chittenden County that happens politically in Vermont by people in all parties.
But
And
that comment about the other Vermont?
well, it's a.
Sometimes you do say
Oh,
that.
well, that Burlington's as close to living in Vermont as it gets.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
but there are, the current administration from time to time really emphasizes that Chittenden County has it good and everybody else is where the emphasis has to go. And the truth is, we need to be supporting all of the 14
sure.
counties
I
because,
agree with
because
that.
a drop-off in Chittenden County may still look good relative to the other counties, but that's a loss of revenue, which supports a lot of government programs. It's a lot of jobs. And so for me, it's always been all 14 counties. And I think in general, the Chittenden delegation, despite
They get
its
that.
potential to cabal up
right.
as 6 people, have taken a much broader view.
Oh, that's good to know.
So
because
I-
I honestly
yeah, I
think
mean, I'm
that
biased in saying it, but that's my
my
view.
impression is sort of out there, and it's
Yeah,
good
no,
to hear
it's-
that it's not the case.
As a resident of Chittenden County, I do appreciate the sentiment of trying to break up. I mean, I think it's really hard to have a district with 6 seats that's representative of that.
I would travel,
Yeah.
before that, we lost a couple towns in the last redistricting, Huntington and Buell's Gore. I guess a town in a gore.
Yeah, Of all four
But from, I pride myself in constituent service and trying to be everywhere at the same time as
Right.
much as possible.
Yeah.
And yet, I know that I can't do the job over the last number of years that I wish I could. When I'm being asked to be in Milton at one moment
Right,
and Bolton
sure.
at another, it's so overwhelming.
Right.
And Chittenden County, where it really is different than being a senator in many other communities, almost every town in Chittenden County has a level of local government which is very, I don't mean advanced in a pejorative sense about other communities, but it has economic development department
Right,
within the town
right.
governments. It
Right.
has really high-end planning
Right.
operations. It has commercial centers, which are a little bit bigger than maybe some of the
For sure.
second or third
Yep.
largest in other counties. So there's a lot more demands pulling at you, and that's why I think I've always said I want the people in Bolton to feel like I care as much about them as Burlington, but there's just no way they can feel that way,
Right.
the way it's
just
currently
right,
configured.
the
Yeah.
dynamics of it
Yeah.
all.
Well, and another thing too that I would say to another point you'd made about like how how Chittenden County feels like the gravity center of Vermont, and that's true in a lot of states. A lot of states feel that way about certain areas. I mean, you look at New Hampshire, 2/3 of their population is in 2 counties, and those are they're southern counties, and that's true in Maine too. Like the bulk of their population is in their southern 2 counties, and the ones that are closest to New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and New York, same story. Like the overwhelming majority of their population is in New York City, and yeah, they have a couple decent-sized cities outside of that, but it's much weighted towards the city.
I like Burlington. It's got good stores.
Yeah. Well, what I like about
And
Burlington,
good restaurants.
and Tim kind of pointed to this, is that it's big enough that it has all the amenities that you want, but
Right.
not so big that I can still be out in the woods in half an
Right.
hour and
Exactly.
get lost.
It's Vermont.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, certainly, what do you think as being pro tem for how many years?
This
did we
is year
say?
4.
Year 4. What has been your biggest accomplishment, and going forward for this year, what are you hoping to accomplish? It's been rolling along.
Yeah, it's I've always struggled with the question of what's been the biggest
Right,
accomplishment.
sure.
In part because I have a lot of interests, and so I put them all on the
Yeah.
table, and I say, well, they're all kind of special and important for people. I think that there are a few things we've done that have been a bit sight unseen, which have been really positive, and things that I think we should be expanding upon. I'll give an example. In the last few years, we've had a program with VHFA, the Vermont Housing Finance
For
Agency,
sure,
to create
right.
down payment assistance.
Right.
Now, to the average person in the public, they're not going to go to a ribbon cutting for a bill to celebrate this. But more than 1,000 people have become first-time homeowners using this program in 174 towns just in the last 3 or 4 years. And we've taken that program and expanded it through the VHFA,
Great.
and probably could do more of that. That gets to the heart of affordability, especially for young people. So that's one that's very important to me. Knowing, having attended UVM and getting out and seeing the only friends I have who buy homes can only afford to buy them in the ring towns because they can't afford the home prices. So
Right.
that's been really
That's
important.
great.
For me, I think, it's been hard. I became pro tem of the Senate basically the same time that Donald Trump became president of the United States, and so there have been moments of sort of not personal pride, but on behalf of the whole Senate, and frankly working sometimes with the governor and with the House, protecting women's reproductive rights is something that I feel like isn't just important to do because I happen to believe it's the right thing, but it was against the sort of prevailing winds going on at the national level and in
Right.
many other states. So I felt that that was something that the state of Vermont really could feel proud about, and I was glad to play a role there. Firearm safety is another area where it has eluded previous governors and legislatures to take reasonable steps that protect people's Second Amendment rights but help try to save people's lives. One of the pieces of legislation, which is the so-called red flag law, extreme risk
right.
protection orders, has been used, I believe, in 13 out of 14 counties already in just a year and a half, primarily to protect people who are at risk of killing themselves. And so
right.
it's a suicide prevention
Right.
tool as much as anything else. We finally found a long-term source of funding for water quality, eluded previous
That's-
governors.
Especially from, speaking of Burlington.
Well, Chittenden County, Franklin County, Lamoille County, Addison, Rutland. I mean,
Right.
it's bedeviled all these communities, and working with the speaker, and ultimately the governor signed on, we were able to come up with a long-term funding plan for that.
I don't think people realize the economic impact of Lake Champlain on the whole state. I mean, what happens to the lake will impact us. It just will.
Yeah, and we've passed a series of bills that relate to clean drinking water and clean sort of natural waters.
Right.
And sometimes it seems almost, it seems very vague to people why it matters to have clean water programs. Just this last weekend, Burlington had a water main break. And I first,
did we?
I first,
we were on
We
a
know this
boil water notice
I
for
first,
48 hours.
I saw on Facebook
Yep.
people saying, I don't have water coming out of my faucet. Well, then 2 hours later, it was citywide boil water. Now, I've been in Burlington now since 1995. I've never seen that happen.
Wow.
No.
Went to
never
the
happened.
supermarket downtown. They have a sign up that says, closed because of the mandatory or the advisory water boil.
Right.
For a day and a half. You couldn't go to the downtown supermarket.
Oh, wow.
Many people, of course, haven't received the email alerts or
Right.
received a text saying,
Right.
don't drink the water. They're happily drinking it away.
Oh.
And so for me, as someone in a city that has, you know, a sophisticated infrastructure to clean
Right.
the water and all that, it was very eye-opening about how hard it must have been in Bennington when people suddenly had to go to
Right.
bottled water and couldn't drink out of their own
Right.
tap. The 3 communities that have PFOA contamination.
Yeah, that's scary.
Lead in the drinking water at schools. So these are, you know, putting together all these has been a really important thing. And anyways, and then there's 1,000 other things that I feel really good about. But
That's it. I think sadly the public they hear about 1 or 2 that have caught the attention of the guns and the abortion.
Yeah.
And, but the rest just sort of don't get communicated out there, and I think
Yeah.
there must be some better way to do that. That's why
It's
we hope this show brings to
Yeah.
people what's really going on, because they
Right.
don't hear about the.
I appreciate that very
that's
much. And I'll
true.
tell you, in the era of Donald Trump, it is very difficult. And you can tell when you're talking to people how
Right.
much or little they have any idea what's going on in
Right.
Montpelier. It is very hard to get people to focus the limited energy and time they have on what's going on in Montpelier because they're so focused and stressed or whatever about what's going on in Washington. And
Well, that's why we picked our listening beyond the sound bites.
Nice.
Because you only hear just bits and pieces,
Yeah.
and usually it's just the bills that have kind of created,
Yeah.
attention or emotion.
The ones people fight about get
Right.
the attention.
Get the
Right.
attention.
Today we passed a piece of legislation on the Senate floor, first step along its journey, related to criminal justice reform. It specifically addresses sentencing and the kind of sanctions that happen if you are out in the community on supervision of corrections, but you make a
Right.
mistake. It is the result of the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch coming together and looking at all the data and the best practices, a series of strategies that we think will reduce the inmate population by about 120 people over the next few years,
Wow.
which is real savings.
Yeah.
It's a big deal,
Right.
both in terms of its policy implications, but as a matter of public safety. And my guess is very few members of the public will really notice
right.
that happened. Now they'll benefit because
Right.
it is going to help create more public safety.
Right.
It'll help people turn their lives around. And obviously, most of what we do is like that,
Yeah.
and we don't do it to get constant recognition. But it is important that people know that.
Yeah.
And so part of our challenge in a legislature where you don't have resources you don't have a communications team, you don't
It's
have
too bad you don't have somebody.
you don't have a budget
somebody.
for mailing,
Right.
you don't get
Right.
money to host a website for yourself, you don't get any of
Right,
that.
right.
And yet you've got to find a way to break through all that noise people
Yeah.
have in their lives.
That's-
We do our best we
actually,
can.
I don't know if you heard about the thing that V.T. Digger did. When did I go to the Dudley Davis?
Oh,
Center?
this is like
2
last
weeks
week or 2 weeks ago? Yeah.
It was about fixing our jails.
Yes.
And that was one. There were 3 things that they mentioned that I was so supportive of. The 4th one, not so much, but it was really solid, right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping people in prison after they've done their time because there's no housing. Really?
Right.
That's not right.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
And so there's a couple others like that, and the one big one that I was like, what?
Yeah, and then
We'll talk about that
Yeah,
later.
exactly.
Well, so to your point, isn't it $70,000 or $80,000 a year that it costs to incarcerate someone?
It's a tricky math.
Yeah, tricky math.
Basically, if you added up the total costs of our in-state jails and divided by the number of people in in-state jails, it's probably somewhere around that number. The very first thing that happens if you reduce the overall inmate population by 1, effectively, is you reduce one person who has to go to Mississippi. The cost of sending someone out of state to Mississippi is about $30,000 a year. We pay basically on a per day basis.
Gotcha.
Right.
And so but you think about that. If you had a strategy which was going to bring 10 people back, that's $300,000 you're not shipping to the company in Mississippi, and that you could either relieve tax pressure or reinvest in something right here, like the kind of housing that would allow someone to get out of a jail in Vermont. So we're calling it justice reinvestment for precisely that reason. We save money on the out-of-state need to send people to the Corrections Corporation of America place in Mississippi. We take the savings, we reinvest it locally in the kinds of things that let even more people successfully re-enter society.
And I think it'd be good to get
reduce
people,
recidivism.
not going out of state like that, because I honestly think, I remember a dad of a prisoner who went out of state somewhere was walking around for the longest time with a sign, "Please bring my son back so I can see him." And I watched it. I was in DMV and I was watching him right outside my window, back and forth, and I thought, well, he's right, and that must help prisoners get better and understand when they get out.
My dad was in the probation department where I grew up for over 40 years, so
no kidding.
Not that I am a student of it as a result of that, but always felt a particular affinity for this kind of policy work. And I often have to relate to constituents who say, but wait, they committed the crime. Who cares if they have to go to Mississippi? Like, that's the consequences.
I don't agree with that.
And what I usually say is, other than the people who are away for a very long time, murderers, people aggravated, rape, things like that, most people are going to be back in the community. So if they're going to be eventually released and back in the community, you want that to be the most successful reintegration as possible. So then you have to factor, okay, which of those either locations they're going to be incarcerated or what programming that we're offering is going to make it so when they get out, which most of them will, they're not committing a crime again. They're not,
they turn back into productive members of society.
Exactly. And so for many people, I'll take whatever angle I have to, either get them back in the workforce, or make it so they won't commit as much crime, once they're released. But I do feel like these are the kinds of things that require that kind of engagement with constituents, which is a little hard in this day and age, but we still have to keep trying to bust through.
For sure. Yeah, I just felt
so
bad for that for the father out there with the sign.
What
are you going to do?
How many people do we have that are being sent to Mississippi at this point in time?
It's about 275. It
so
depends
pretty
on
significant.
the day. It was when I arrived in the Senate. First day I stepped foot was January 2009. There were about 675. So a lot of progress has been made
Good for you.
after an earlier justice reinvestment approach when Governor Douglas was still in office, and various strategies and maybe some good luck. It dropped down to about 275. The thing is, it's been very stubborn because once you've taken the low-level offenders out of incarceration, once you've used diversion and community justice, you've reduced this. I don't want to reduce people to this metaphor, but the low-hanging fruit is gone.
Right.
So now you've got people who have done more complicated crimes or present more complicated challenges to successfully getting them back in the community. So that number has just been sort of fixed. That's why when we looked at the data most recently as a result of this three-branch effort, we realized many of the people who are incarcerated today, especially, well, men and women, it's not that they're in for the original crime they committed. Most of them have been released to the community and then did something that caused them to be sent back in. Now, a small percentage of them commit a new crime. They go out and they commit a sexual assault, they beat up their spouse, they do something like that.
But most of them
are called technical violations. Now, some technical violations are worse than others. But many of them, if we looked at it with a perhaps more practical eye, would say, wait a sec, is the right thing to do to send the person back for 10 days to jail where they can't go to work, so now their boss might lay them off, fire them, whatever, because they're not reliable, disrupts their family life, childcare is all the stuff that would come with suddenly being sent back in for short sentences. We're not talking about going back for 2 years. We're saying sometimes 3 days. But
they talked at this jail thing that VT Digger sponsored was that sometimes they stay longer than their sentence. And maybe they've got multiple that it adds up, but if they're finished their sentence, just send them home. I'm sorry.
It's a big challenge for us, and we have to.
Because some of them are like being late for a meeting, things that aren't really, in my mind, up there.
And that's what we've tried to do with this legislation is to remove the worst overreactions to non-harmful offenses.
That's
and,
good.
oh,
Good
and,
job.
and there are a lot of them, so it'll add
Was
up.
that Sears's committee? You did that? Was
It
Dick
is
Sears?
Judiciary.
Judiciary.
Continues to be the
He
chair.
did a good job. He
He
spoke at that
continues to
event.
be the chair.
He was there. Yeah, I was there in the back of the room
Oh,
for
were you?
the last half.
I
of
thought it was great. They
He's-
did one the other night about FOIA requests and, how some we're going to write something about that. 'Cause
Yeah,
that
that-
was interesting.
He's
too.
been the chair of that committee for what, 2 decades?
Oh, yeah, forever.
Not quite, but
Close enough.
still
Anyway,
youthful. Still youthful.
So this year you've got a whole. I just started writing things that are really active in the Senate, and the one I wanted to ask you about, and there might be some that you want. Act 250. I've been following that on the House side for Campaign for Vermont, and now it's in Ways and Means. But the committee has worked on it for like a year and a half. Are you really? Do you think you're going to get it out this year? That's a lot of research and a lot of.
It is, and
Complicated issue, too.
Last year, the House and Senate leadership get together at the beginning of the 2-year biennium to talk about division of labor, because you can't have everyone doing the same thing
Right.
at the. It just,
Right.
and the House committee was going to take up any Act 250 changes. To be fair, there was a new chair of the committee, and almost every member of the committee was new. So,
Yes, I
so,
noticed that.
So it was not as if you took people who had been through this material over and over,
Right.
and then just said, okay, put together your best thinking
Right.
and get it out. It was a lot of getting up to speed with the policies and really understanding
not
how
an
Act
easy
250 works.
topic.
Especially many people, if you're not familiar with it, people have heard Act 250 as this political wedge issue.
Right.
But once you get beyond the soundbite of Act 250 stifling development, or the other people saying, oh, they just want to kill the environment.
Right.
Once you get past that, it's actually really complex, and you realize there's a lot to be commended, and then there are challenges that we should probably be working on.
Right.
And so they did not get us a bill last year,
Right.
is the short story. This year, they believe that we will get a bill more or less around our typical crossover
Oh, really?
deadline.
Because it's got to go to one more committee in the House. And I forget
Probably
which one.
appropriations.
Oh, of course,
But,
appropriations.
but we have, I've instructed the Senate Committee on Natural Resources, which is the
Right,
one that will
right.
receive this, to stay on top of the work that's been done in the House. And whenever something's been identified as pretty much a lock, that it's
Right.
going to come over, to start the
Oh,
work
good,
now.
good decision.
If we didn't do that, we would get the
Good.
bill in April or
Yeah,
something,
right.
and there's be no time, because
Right.
we're not going to take out. I abolished the rubber stamps when
Oh.
I became pro tem of the Senate.
Yeah.
We don't just rubber
What is
stamp
that?
anything.
Just pass it and then read it later.
Yeah, we'll read it later. I've seen that happen sometimes.
Right.
And so we will get some changes, and I think it's a good sign that. I mean, I hate to break people into these categories because life is so much more complicated, but
Yeah.
many of the groups that sort of focus on environmental protection have been working with groups that have been focusing on development, housing,
Right.
and things like that. And they've worked together on a kind of a package of items which
Oh.
they felt represented things that, not all the stuff were comfort zone items,
Right.
but nothing went so far to make them truly uncomfortable.
Right.
And so they were able to put that on the table. That's what the House has been working
Right,
from.
right.
I'm particularly interested in seeing some progress, in
Yeah.
part because I've been through Act 250. There are a lot of
This
people.
is 94 pages of
Yeah.
I
stuff.
know some of it's, but some of it's legislation can look more. Of
Yeah,
a,
right, can skim
I've seen
over it, yeah.
I've seen a single word mean more than 10 pages.
Oh,
If it-
yeah.
there you
may to
go.
shall can mean
Yeah.
more than 10 pages of technical jargon. But I've been through Act 250, and there are a lot of people who talk a good game about Act 250, but it is important that it be sort of reharnessed from
Right,
time to time to reflect the world that's changed around us.
Yeah.
And a very simple example of the kind of changes that I really look forward to voting on are communities that have very rigorous and comprehensive local review
Local,
of
right,
projects
right, planning and zoning.
should not compel the person who's the applicant to go through two effectively mirror image processes
Right.
that stagger time-wise, so you're doubling the length of time plus all the fees that go to the local community,
Right.
plus the local fees that are going to go to the state for Act
Right.
250. And
It should be one process.
one
Right,
process, as long as you're not diminishing the kind of
Exactly.
Right.
exactly.
sensitivity to the environment and transportation impacts.
From the, I think the two, often you get, whoever's proposing a development, right? And then, there's usually some community group or environmental group that's opposing it for various reasons, and oftentimes they're legitimate reasons, or they just But the real question, I think, is the developers want a predictable process, right? It's not so much that they want it to be quick and easy. They just want to know we do all of these things the right way, we're going to get to a resolution. And then folks who are potentially appealing that process, they want an opportunity to make sure their voice is heard and they have a fair opportunity to weigh in. And I think one of the probably most stark examples of where I think a lot of people would say the process may have failed is Costco's gas station, right? Which is an example in our backyard, right?
For sure.
Of two business groups in this case, one of which wants to put in a low-cost gas station. There happens to be an existing one right next door to it, who's appealing on all these different grounds, right? And has been for 15 years?
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. And biggest...
Costco's ready to go. Those things are
they've
up.
got the daily price that you would pay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love the big poster they put up of like, we will turn the pumps on as soon as the appeals stop.
You can understand
It's
Skip's upsetment for sure.
well,
right?
he has a right to do it under the
Right.
current conditions.
Under the
and
current
so
conditions,
while I wish that Costco would be competing to benefit the people who have to pay their gas bills, or to fill up at the pump. He hasn't broken any rules doing it.
Right.
And,
So it's and so what it really points to is the process piece, right? Is that this process that has gone on for years and years and years with sometimes legitimate complaints, but oftentimes contrived complaints, right?
Well, I hope we'll get to the other side of it. Another area that's really important to me is addressing for the long term the issue of trails. So we have everything from Kingdom Trails and other bike networks to Vast Trails to the Catamount Trail, even the Long Trail, the issues of how we handle development that occurs. And when people think development, they always think, a big hotel going up somewhere, but it takes a lot of manipulation of the ground and rocks and moving stuff and trucks to make these trails and the runoff. And so right now it's becoming more and more prone to falling into these gray areas where it's not clear if it triggers Act 250. Now, if you own let's say you own a property that, let's say it's 20 acres and you live on the road at the front, but somewhere in the back, a trail, you give permission for someone to run part of a trail network through the back of your property. The question is, does that make your whole property now suddenly trigger Act 250, even though you're just the home on the front of the land? Those are the kinds of issues that I also hope we'll resolve.
I was
and then who is also responsible for making that application, right? And all those organizations you just mentioned do exactly that. They go across private land, usually, always with permission, and they're constructing a trail, which, especially in terms of mountain biking trails, can be pretty.
It's intensive.
It's intensive.
Yeah.
I was chair of the Barry City Bike Path for years. And just stepped down, about a year ago, I think. That process needs to be looked at.
Well, that's why I'm saying I'm hoping we'll make progress.
And people need it. They want it. It's the health, the prevention. It's great. Let's skip to the running for LG because I think I'm looking at the time and you need lots of times to talk about this.
Well.
So yes, all right. We'll use this show to keep people appraised of what's going on legislature. But on January 8th. You announced that you want to run for lieutenant governor because Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman was deciding to run for governor.
Right.
So why are you interested in? I love that job though.
Lieutenant Governor. That's a great gig.
You like saying it? Is that the?
No, it's a great job, and I love the office. It's really the whole thing. That chandelier in that office is the best one in the State House.
Well, the president of the Senate, my office is a very
small.
Yeah,
you have a closet.
There's a lot of jealousy.
You lost that
but that's not why I'm running for lieutenant governor. Honestly, there's really two things. I mean, there's the transitioning out of the Senate. I mean, I've felt so blessed to be representing the Senate as the president for 4 years, but Chittenden County Senate now 12 years. And I always said to myself, I'm not going to stay just because I can. And there's a moment where it's time for someone else to come in and follow and do their thing. And that applies both as just a member of the Senate, but also as the Senate president.
Right.
And so, I'm feeling that moment has come. It's time for someone else to have that spot. And in the last 3 or 4 years, one of the things I've enjoyed most about being the president of the Senate is I've tried to tell all the Senate committees to get out of the State House, not to do just a field trip where you take a picture at
Right.
a new housing ribbon cutting or something, but to actually hold committee meetings out in the field.
Great idea.
And every committee has done that in the Senate at least once, some of them 3, 4 times.
Great.
And it just brings government right to people. It allows people who aren't in the State House, who aren't lobbyists or don't hire lobbyists, to actually sit at the table and say what it looks like from where they are.
Yeah.
And I have supported that by doing my own rounds around the state and trying to fact find on different topics and then bringing them back and handing them off to all the committees in the Senate and the House. So I toured all the mental health agencies in the state. When I say toured, we asked to meet directly with all the frontline staff who are actually doing the work to ask them what they're seeing out there, what are the things that would make their jobs easier, what would make it easier to recruit and retain people, because
That's a
they
big
suffer.
deal.
Big issue,
They
yeah.
suffer mightily. Some of
Yep.
them have frontline staff turnover of 50%
Yep.
a year when you're
Yeah.
dealing with very challenged population. So after going around the state, came back with a series of recommendations that I heard directly from people, was able to put it on the table in the appropriations room in our Health and Welfare Committee, which does the policy around this, and then we see things turn into action from that. Met with primary care docs around the state over the course of a couple months, did a series of events. One of the things they flagged was the very desperate need for adult dental access, especially for people who don't have much money, because they're seeing people show up
Didn't
at the
think about
emergency
that.
room
Yeah.
with dental pain that is all avoidable, except that
Yeah.
they just couldn't get a dentist to see
Right.
them or didn't have the money
And
to do
if
it.
something's wrong with your teeth, it actually
It doesn't
impacts-
end well.
It impacts your whole body
yeah,
because it's
dental-
just bad.
We've not thought about dental health
Yeah,
as
you're right.
associated with physical health, but it is very, very much linked. And
Yeah.
so as a result of that, came back, discussions with my peers in the Senate. We did the largest adult Medicaid expansion in 30 years. Now, some people might say, oh, well, you're just throwing more money at a government
No, that's
program.
important.
But the thing is, it will save money over
Yeah.
time as people get that care up front rather than showing up at the emergency
Right.
room.
Right.
So I was able to do that on
Great.
a whole bunch of issues. Youth employment, which was actually maybe the kind of my passion project. Meeting with everybody from tech centers to local employers, colleges, trying to figure out how to get young people, especially people between the ages of, say, 16 and 22, who just fall through the cracks if
Right.
they don't have family that have connections who can get them into internships
Right.
and things. And as a result of that, and working, actually, this has been a issue I've been able to work with the governor for 2 years in a row on. We've created opportunities across the state for a whole bunch of young people to learn some job skills, get a little money to be
Right.
paid while they're doing it. And that came as a result of going out to people. So the job of lieutenant governor, that is almost the most potential the position brings, is actually precisely to be able to elevate some of those issues, interact with people outside the Montpelier bubble, come back and deliver good ideas, and then be the voice piece to kind of pound away and see that they happen. And so to me, that's a very exciting prospect.
They always talk about the children that are in state care and the cliff. When they're 18, there's very little, I think, support. They just, you're gone and that's it, and you're out on your own. And there's not much help for them to get jobs, to know what to do.
It's a
'cause
real problem,
it's
and
another
Frank
world.
Coffey, who you'll both be
Oh, for
familiar
sure.
with, the GBIC, which
Yeah.
is the Economic Development Corp in my community, talked to me 2 or 3 years ago about this issue of thousands of kids in that age range
Yep.
who are just dropping kind of off the radar altogether. They're not going on to any schooling.
Yep.
They're not going on to any jobs. And you say, well, where the heck are they going? And we don't really know. But what we know is they're probably not fulfilling their potential.
For sure.
And so to me, with all the demographic challenges we have, with the skill disconnect we have in terms of people being job ready for even relatively low skill positions, to me, we can't afford to be losing thousands of young people every year or two while we face those
I
headwinds.
didn't realize that number was
It's
that large.
it's not a
staggering.
good picture,
No.
and these are largely kids coming from households with a lot of challenges,
Yeah.
and it's not easy work
Yeah.
to help equip them, but that is the job of government and public partnerships
Yeah,
with
and that lieutenant
nonprofit
governor,
and private
you've got-
resources.
It's a half part-time job is the word I was looking for.
yeah. Well, it's
But it's not really, but you have another
You
half
have
a
some
day to
flexibility.
get out. Yes.
You have the
That's
flexibility
right.
that you don't have if you're pinned managing the day-to-day in the
Right.
Senate, and so
So that's a good question because you're you have a reputation for being a policy guy, right? You try
If
to
it's said as a compliment,
Says
I
policy
accept.
on it.
If it's a compliment, I accept.
Yes, it is. He's a policy one, too.
All right, from you, I
He likes
accept.
it.
Okay.
Accept the charge.
Fair enough. You know, and as such, I know you like to dive in and like really deconstruct a problem, right? And I kind of approach things the same way. Like you like to deconstruct a problem, figure out what the real core issue is, and what's the best way to solve it. You know, and a lot of that is in the sausage making process in the legislature, and the lieutenant governor role kind of steps back from that a little bit. So I'm kind of curious. You know, it sounds like you want to use that office as more of an advocacy role, which is really what Howard Dean brought to the lieutenant governor's role. Like, there's not a whole lot of statutory authority as a lieutenant governor, right? Your role is often more ceremonial. You can use it as a platform to advocate for things, and that's really the flavor that Howard Dean and most of the lieutenant governors since then has brought to that. Right. Is that really the path you're going down? Is to grab some of these things you're really passionate about and bring them to the state?
Yeah, one of the things that it's the blessing and curse of being the president of the Senate is that you get to have your hand in all the issues because you're working with your committee chairs and the other members of the committees every day on the whole menu of items that are being considered. What you lose a little, though, is the part where you bring your passions to the table.
Right.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I get to work on things. I continue to be proud of the work we do, some of which are things that I help get to the finish line personally. But I don't spend 100% of my time focused on the issues I care most about.
Right.
I'm focused on 100% of my time is on what the group has decided, and that includes not just the majority party, but also the minority party. And so that's been my job for 4 years. I've been dutiful. I give everything I have to it. But the lieutenant governor's position allows you to pick the things that you are personally passionate about, go out, elevate those, and advocate. And it is true, once you hand it off to the legislature, they typically don't say, hey, Mr. Lieutenant Governor or Madam Lieutenant Governor, come help us write the bill now that we're in the committee room.
Yeah.
It doesn't go down like that, and I'd have to appreciate that. But to me, a couple of the themes that are often talked about, but we don't get the coherent action that would be ideal. I really believe that rural economic vitality is something that there's a lot of talk about, and we've made some inroads in recent years, and we've tried to prioritize it in the Senate, and I'm sure in the House. But really thinking realistically and strategically about all 14 counties and what we do for communities that aren't going to get the old factory back, which used to be the source of employment for people with a high school diploma. So to me, going out to communities and then being able to come back and say, hey, legislature, especially knowing how much appetite there is for it, here's the best thinking in Community X about how we can really strengthen the assets that they have to work with. Young people in the workforce would be another one. I believe very firmly that the demographic challenges are real. I am always amazed the politicization of demographic trends. They are what they are right now.
Right. You can't.
And we have some efforts to try to entice people to come to Vermont. They're really small parts of the budget. Some people don't like it because they think it's not right to give people money to come here. But to them, I'd say it's a tiny microscopic piece of the whole budget. So
and there's a return on that investment.
Yeah, it's working.
But also, like, don't stress it if you don't like it because it's really a small piece. For those who think it's going to save the state, that's not going to happen either because people come for a variety of reasons. It's not going to be just for this small enticement in the grand scheme of things. What we really need to emphasize as the core part of any strategy about filling the jobs people need is getting the most out of people who are already here.
Right.
And we have a tech center infrastructure through our high schools, which, as commendable as each facility is, I don't know that there's the integration there ought to be. We have a dizzying array of programs through the Department of Labor, which you, I think, know well. But we have job training programs, not just at the Department of Labor, at the Agency of Human Services, the Agency of Education. It's all across state government. Dozens of these programs, some of which serve 2 people here, 4 people there.
I should send you my proposal, which was poo-pooed about bringing them all together.
Well, I look forward to seeing it because
Seriously.
but what it does is it means that all of our staff working on this and granting to nonprofits and private entities are scrambling all the time to do lots of little bureaucratic exercises rather than having one thematic approach which says, hey, if you're in this demographic and you want to have skills, don't come and tell us which program you're eligible for. Tell us what you want to do.
We'll match it.
We'll figure out the rest.
A
for
case
you."
manager.
Yeah.
Effectively, someone who is
Yeah,
your problem
right.
solver. And this is sometimes has me running afoul of some of the entities who receive state grants. We cannot have 100 different demonstration projects going on at all times. There are some things which are bread and butter activities which can be replicated. The Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, to me, is one of the perfect examples of something that already has an administrative infrastructure. The public's understanding of it is all positive. They see young people who are
Right.
kind of jazzed.
Right.
Some of it's outside work, some inside work, but they gain skills, they learn how to work in teams. We need entities like Vermont Works for Women would be another good
Right.
example. We need to expand and build on those known, high quality, ready to go administrative structures. And that to me is something that, getting outside the State House bubble and working in the community level, we can come back and figure some of that out. So there's a lot of other things that I would elevate. You can't run on everything.
Right.
But the last piece I'll just say is really the affordability question. And that's another one where I know the politics of it. Governors always talk about affordability. The legislature says, but we care about that too, but it's harder to get your voice out there.
Right.
But issues like home ownership, to me, we have to make home ownership more realistic for young people in communities with high housing prices, which is virtually everywhere in the state. Loan repayment, we can't probably afford it to do it for all student debt, the way people talk about at national debates.
But there's a conversation about CCV right now.
There is a conversation about CCV, which can
and
go some.
it's actually a surprisingly low price point.
The price point is not that low, and the question, we'll work through that. But I'll tell you, as a student graduating from grad school with tremendous financial debt as a result of my borrowing to go to grad school, I would not have been able to return to Vermont if my school did not have its own loan repayment program. So I don't need a philosophy, I don't need to be, it's not a philosophical discussion for me. It was the difference maker between me being somewhere else trying to make enough money to pay back my loans, or me being here and being able to do public service and other things that I've done. And so that's another key piece of it. And then on the jobs front, I think it used to be that people in private industry said government doesn't create jobs, you stay out of it, create the infrastructure. Well, there's more of an expectation that government play a role in kind of supporting and incubating and developing jobs, to keep it on simple terms. In my view, what we really need to do is revitalize the core of these communities so that people would want to locate their small businesses too.
Right.
I think one of the really exciting, if modest, things that's going on around the state right now is the co-working spaces that have popped up in many
for
communities,
sure,
including here in Montpelier. It doesn't solve the demographic crisis. It doesn't create 2,000 new
You're
jobs.
talking like Bradbury's?
Exactly.
Oh my God, that's
what it does
fabulous.
is says to people, I have a place I can go. I'm going to benefit by being around other people who have some skills that I'm not going to hire a person full-time to do.
Right.
And I'm not sitting home alone feeling kind of like a little lonely. I get a little bit of the connection like being in a typical workplace. And then people can, they offset some of the fixed costs of running a business. They can share infrastructure like, whether it's the 3D printer or the copy machine, whatever it is, all that stuff gets shared into the cost. And that's the kind of infrastructure we need. I mean, broadband into downtowns. Some small communities still don't have high-speed broadband into just the core of the village center. So those are the kinds of things that I'd really want to figure out. You can't have a unique program for every community, but some communities could use a little bit of a nudge, and I think that's a role that the state can play.
That's great.
What I love about co-working spaces is the water cooler talk, right, that happens. Because that's normal in a business office, right? You get people that run into each other in the hallways or in the kitchen or whatever, and conversations happen and ideas get sparked from that. But in co-working spaces, it's sometimes even more than that, because you have people from totally different industries.
You can get technical expertise from people they'll share.
Yeah, well, someone that's totally outside of your industry, totally outside of your knowledge base. And spark conversations, and sometimes those conversations lead to something.
Well, that's to me that's one of the I've been to a number of them, including VSET, which is located on Main Street in Burlington, and since many small businesses are now doing work that doesn't really need a big bricks and mortar workplace with 50 people, but might be design work or software development, programming, things like that. That kind of office cooler discussion that you're describing often leads to someone getting a job that is linked to by the other person.
Right.
Someone who needs someone for, you know, a 1-month project, but you're around people who are constantly feeding you those opportunities that you wouldn't get if you're sitting back at your home, you know,
Right.
making coffee with Mr. Coffee.
Have you ever been to Dave Bradbury's setup?
Yes.
It is so
Yeah,
funky.
it's
I just
awesome.
love it. It's open and everybody supports everybody. It's fabulous.
Around the state, there are many others that don't
I've
have
heard that. I
they
haven't-
don't have the level of, they don't have the cool factor
Oh,
that
really?
VSET
It's
does. Some of
so
them,
cool.
they're cool because of what they're doing,
Yeah.
even if their resources are more
Have
modest.
you talked to Matt Dunn?
I have talked to Matt Dunn a number of times.
He was
yes.
on. He was on our
Yeah.
show. That is. He just put out an email about how much progress they're making
Yeah.
in getting to
Doing some
rural
awesome
communities.
stuff.
Yeah, it's very
Fabulous,
positive in a community
fabulous.
that desperately needed
Yeah.
a kickstart.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, and I mean, this is right in line with the stuff that we've been talking about at Campaign for Vermont for years about, you know, workforce development. Because the last 4, 5, 6 years, the challenge hasn't so much been job creation, right? The job creation's been fairly strong last several years. It's the workforce
Right,
piece.
to fill the positions.
The filled positions and the technical skills, because where the jobs are today is not where the workforce is in terms of skill set. So you either need to retrain your workforce. The problem is a lot of that workforce is already tied up in jobs that they do have skills
Right.
for. So we need to grow the workforce, and there's a couple ways to do that. You can go out and try to attract more people to the state, which is a difficult proposition,
Sure.
right? And we talked a little bit about that. You know, that's we have these incentives out there, but you know, and they do work for what they're supposed to. It's a tool in the toolbox, but it's not the end-all be-all answer. One of the other strategies is pulling people who are not currently engaged in the workforce, right? So folks that have either fallen off the career path somewhere, or you know, maybe are coming into second careers, right? They've retired from one career and they maybe have a pension plan or retirement plan, and have time and energy to still do something. So pulling those people back into the workforce and teaching them, giving them skills.
It's an interesting issue. This past year, there was you know, the legislature, when it doesn't want to take action, creates study committees.
Oh.
One such was a study group that met in the off season to look at the state of Vermont's compliance with the Older Americans Act, which is a federal
Oh,
act.
interesting.
And a number of programs, like the agencies on aging, the money comes through that federal act.
Right.
Several of us in the Senate said, well, you know, obviously we have to comply with the federal law in order to get these funds, but our state needs to be thinking about aging much more broadly, because many
And we're living longer too.
older
because of
Vermonters
this.
are not receiving those kinds
Yeah.
of public benefit programs,
Yeah.
and yet still have a lot to offer. And so one of the things that we've worked with our counterparts in the House to do is say that we want probably the Secretary of Administration, who your listeners might not know, basically runs government for whoever the governor is, to have a master plan on aging that isn't just focused on people who are on public benefit programs, precisely so that we're not neglecting the opportunity to utilize the skills and time and willingness to work that many older Vermonters today have, but just aren't being connected to the
right.
opportunities. And in the coming years, as we know, because of the demographic trends, there are going to be many more people.
We're gonna get hit by that, and it's gonna be like a school bus hit.
It is
Yeah,
going to be
right.
like a school bus unless we do some upfront work
Right.
to manage
You know,
that better.
just one more thing I would add to Ben's list of things we should do is I've always thought we should put on a full court press to UVM, to all of our colleges where out-of-state students have picked to be in
40,000
Vermont.
a year.
There you go.
40,000 students a
40,000
year that-
students
yeah.
have picked Vermont to go to school because they like the skiing, because they
Right.
like the school, obviously, but just the lifestyle. Why are we not putting a full court press, find out what they're taking, try to create jobs that are a match and get them to stay
Well,
here?
you're a product of that, right?
Yes, there you
That's
go.
the pattern I
We
followed.
never do
and,
it.
Well, and one of the challenges, I think, and I think we're doing a bit better job today than maybe it would have been 10 years ago. You know, higher ed institutions, in particular the University of Vermont, they think about career readiness through their own lens as a higher ed
Right,
institution.
right.
They weren't first and foremost saying, how are we going to help the state?
That's right.
And
Right.
each of the state college campuses had some similar thing going where, yeah, there's in the background, yeah, we'd like to find people connections here, but it's really about supporting the students in whatever
For sure.
job interviews they're,
Right.
you know, ginning up or whatever. I think there's an increasing relationship between state and the various higher ed institutions, which I think is very promising, especially with the University of Vermont, which has 2/3 or whatever students who are from out of state, and they're coming out with bachelor's or more in either Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Arts. And it's always discouraging when you speak to the CEO or HR director of a firm that has, say, engineering positions open, and there are people graduating from UVM, and you suspect they have no idea that there's a good paying job down the road, which would allow them to stay in Burlington or stay in Castleton or wherever. So those are areas that we've probably faltered a little bit in the past, but there are opportunities to pick for the future.
I've certainly talked about that over the years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it just falls on deaf ears. And
Well,
I suppose it'd be a lot of work to do it right, but it would be worth it in the end if kids stay.
Well, if you think about the University of Vermont as an organization, it is effectively the same heft as state government is.
Well, yes,
and
it
you can
is.
have the new president is very excited to find ways to partner with employers.
Oh.
But don't forget, he's managing a culture of thousands of people that has to gradually shift, just like trying to change things in state government. I have to say sometimes doesn't happen at a rapid pace.
Really?
Yes.
Gosh. Wow, that shocks
Never
me.
happens as fast as you want it to happen.
When I want the change, I wish it was rapid. When I don't want it, I wish it was glacial.
So, Tim, we have 2 minutes left, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about why we should vote for you, why you present the right qualifications for the lieutenant governor job, because as Governor Dean found out, sometimes you have to sadly step up when something happens to the EOC. You didn't mention that. Yeah.
Well, it's it's first of all, to run and be considered for lieutenant governor is already an amazing opportunity, and it's a little daunting and a privilege to even be in the mix. But what I hope people would see in me is a track record, first of all, and I think the last 3 years in terms of being able to work with people from both the Democratic and Republican parties, and also the progressives and independents who are around, have a Senate that operates in a way that respects people's position, even if they're opposite positions, has been able to pass, working with my colleagues, not trying to showboat or take all the credit, but spreading the credit wherever it's been due on issues like protecting women's rights, taking care of the environment, addressing climate change while trying to keep the price of electricity down, passing the first significant gun safety legislation, working on getting more people who are new Americans into our workforce, a whole variety of areas of progress which are not mine alone to take credit for, but under my leadership we've been able to make really significant progress. My outside government experience as an affordable housing developer for 8 years, where we renovated or built about 400 senior apartments, developed solar projects, did one of the largest weatherization projects. Doesn't make me the perfect fit for any position, but I have a really deep sense from a professional background, not only of land use planning, meeting human needs, because we were often dealing with people who were very low income with health issues, dealing with public, private, and nonprofit to come together to do projects that benefited everybody, is really extensive. And so I have watched that pay off as I have been the policy wonk, perhaps, according to some, and hopefully benefited the legislation I worked on. And then ultimately, it's a readiness question, and I really feel that, God forbid, should anything ever happen to whoever the governor is going to be in January, I really do think sometimes people forget when you're voting for lieutenant governor, what you're really saying is that if something were to happen, that this person is ready to step in and hold things down in a very difficult time. And I'm not presumptuous enough to know what that would look like, but I do know that I know government inside and out, and have seen it work at its best in partnership with people outside government. I've also seen when it trips up sometimes, and bring all of that experience, but would think that I'd be ready to step in that awful situation should it ever arise. So I bring a level of energy to it. I think people who have seen me in the Senate have watched me in action, and I find a lot of enjoyment about doing the things that the public sector is uniquely positioned and required to do on behalf of the people. And and would just be tremendously honored if I got the position.
Great ending to the show. Thank you very much. We wish you a lot of luck. You
Thank
probably
you.
have to face a primary, do you know that?
There'll be a primary.
There's a few of them.
There's
There's
a
a
few
few
of
of them in
them,
there.
right?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's the thing. Everyone's entitled to run, so I've got a
Exactly.
daunting set of
Well,
tasks
keep that
ahead.
energy up. That's great.
I will have to.
So, all right. Thank you all for tuning in. I enjoyed the show. I hope you did too. It was great to have the Senate Pro Tem as our guest. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.